Welcome to MetaStrategy's Forum on World-Class IT. I'm Peter High, and I'm pleased to welcome David Bray to the broadcast. David is the Chief Information Officer of the Federal Communications Commission, an agency of the U.S. government, and has held that role since August of 2013. As CIO, David leads the modernization of the Commission's technology endeavors. His efforts in modernizing the more than 200 systems of the FCC were recognized with the firm's Cloud Computing Leadership Award in 2015. Prior to joining the FCC, David served in many other areas of government, including stints at the CDC's Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Program, the Department of Energy, and the Institute for Defense Analyses. David is also a prolific presence on social media, appearing at the top of many social CIO lists, including mine on Forbes.com. David earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Computer Science and Biology, a Master of Science degree in Public Health, and a PhD in Information Systems, each from Emory University. He's also been a visiting associate at the University of Oxford and was a postdoctoral associate in 2008 at both MIT and Harvard. I recently caught up with David in his office in Washington, D.C., and our conversation covered world-class IT Principle 1, People, as we discussed how he matches the current workforce and skill sets at the FCC to strategic future plans. Principle 2, Infrastructure, as we discussed the balance between implementing cloud infrastructure and ensuring that it's as secure as possible. Principle 4, IT and Business Partnerships, as we discussed the creative ways in which he communicates with his staff, his colleagues outside of IT at the FCC, and beyond, as well as a variety of other topics. This is Peter High. Please consider reading my new book, Implementing World-Class IT Strategy, How IT Can Drive Organizational Innovation. The book covers topics such as the CIO as Strategic Facilitator, the development of IT missions, facilitating corporate and divisional strategy, the development of IT's own strategic plans, the development of enterprise architecture, reviewing, refreshing, and communicating strategy, and several other topics, all told with stories from leading CIOs from a variety of major corporations. You can find it at Amazon.com, my publisher's website, Wiley.com, and at your better bookstores. Thank you very much. Well, David Bray, welcome to the Forum on World-Class IT.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
It's a pleasure. David, I thought we'd begin with your current role. Most people who are listening probably are familiar to some extent with the FCC, but maybe not the sort of inner workings of it, and certainly not the inner workings of the Chief Information Officer's role. And I wonder if you could take a couple of moments to introduce your role within the organization.
Sure. So I parachuted into my role as Chief Information Officer at the FCC about 20 months ago. And when I arrived, there had been about 9 CIOs in 8 years prior to my arrival. And the FCC itself is about 18 different bureaus and offices with about 1,750 government employees. And of course, our scope is anything involving wired or wireless across the United States. And so my role as Chief Information Officer was focused on the fact that when I arrived, I assessed that they had about 207 different IT systems. Again, for only 750 people. So I sometimes joke, I say, I feel like I'm Oprah Winfrey. Look in your chair, everyone's going to go home today, and you get an IT system, take it, it's free. So how did we get there? I think we got there because over the last 20 years, whenever there was a new request, either from the administration or from Congress, or there was a new law, FCC would roll out a new IT system. And that works for the first 5 or 10 years. But over time, you've just accumulated so many different IT systems that the case was easily at least 80% of our IT budget was spent mainly sustaining what we already had. And so that really limited what I could actually do in terms of new development. And while I'm sure I could spend the next 5 to 10 years updating each one of those 207 systems, I should note actually more than half of them were more than 10 years old. I think by the time I do that, then I'd have to do it all over again. So we actually decided to do a new shift technology-wise, which was actually move to what's called a common data platform that would be cloud-based, where we actually take the data from these existing legacy systems and then build a very thin user interface with reusable code, because there may be elements that are common across these different systems, like authenticate a user, export to PDF, produce a map, that we don't have to produce 207 different times. Instead, we can reuse that code as part of a service catalog. And that way, we can then be more efficient and effective in what we're doing. And so we've had some early successes. The other thing that's also been trying to do is actually address the human element, too. The team was at half strength And while we're not going to probably bring it back up to historical strength of what its size was, trying to bring in both new people and integrate them with the existing staff.
Both those sound like quite daunting and complex tasks. I'm wondering from a technology perspective, starting there first, how did you determine where to begin? How did you prioritize? Because obviously, I'm sure you didn't attack all areas at once, but rather had sort of a logical stair step to your ultimate destination, which I know you're still in the process of getting to.
Right. So I would easily say that the first 3 to 4 months of my role was trying to listen and understand as many people as I can meet. And the nice thing about FCC is, again, because we're small, it's fairly easy. I can meet people here at our headquarters location, as well as in Gettysburg. I also went out to the different field offices, because I'm a big believer that one should seek to listen and seek to understand before one seeks to be listened to. And so what I tried to do in that sense was, one, to meet with as many people as possible. We also had an open house where I actually, on my own funds, brought in coffee and donuts and just invited people to come. We continue to do those. And just to hear the narratives. And what you find out is really the 18 different bureaus and offices, in some respects, are all unique in their different requirements. And so any technology solution will have to allow for that diversity, that you can't do a single system that's going to solve everybody's issues. The other thing is, of course, some of these systems were actually defined by law, to the level of actually naming the IT system itself. And so any update, in some respects, might actually take an act of Congress, which is always interesting, too. So I always like near impossible missions. In fact, I often say that the harder the challenge, the more I'm interested in taking it on. And so after about the 3 or 4 month period, it really was focusing on what are the systems that are most likely to leak. They believe that you don't wait after 20 years to replace your roof. You try to replace it as soon as possible, even if it hasn't leaked yet. And so we actually embarked around the February timeframe of 2014 on beginning a strategy of updating, one, our consumer help desk, which was about 15 years old and was public facing. And we knew that that was going to be a source if anyone had any complaints about anything relating to telecommunications. It was a way to publicly engage us. It was client server. Literally 32-bit, and so, of course, in the web age, if you have a lot of people coming in at the same time, it might be a bit of a challenge. So the good news is we first shopped around and we looked at what was the gold standard for other public-facing organizations, as well as in the private sector. And we were quoted about $3.2 million and anywhere between 18 and 24 months for what I would call big iron, so basically on-site servers and all the integration work there. And at the same time, on the human capital side, we had actually started reaching out for people that I would say are your non-traditional public servants. These were creative people. One had his own startup, but was willing to start off initially 1 or 2 days a week also working at the FCC. Another case was someone that was about to do a PhD, but was willing to defer it for a year or two to help out with the FCC as well. And so we brought them in to integrate with the team. And basically, I often say that, well, there never will be an IPO. We'll never have an IPO in government. We will have a reverse IPO, which I call an opportunity for positive impact. And I basically gave them autonomy. And so they ran with it. And one of these change agents, because I like to call them change agents, made a proposal of let's do software as a service instead of actually doing big iron for the consumer help desk. And that allowed us to do it in less than 6 months. And instead of being 3.2 million, it actually was only 450,000.
For the stereotype of government being inefficient, this is a very nice story of government efficiency, actually.
Exactly.
You talked about the human element in both of your responses for good reason. And as I think about the way you described what you were met with from a technology perspective and where you're going, the kinds of skills that are necessary to manage the new version of what IT is becoming are different from what was here previously. The lack of iron within the building, the increasingly using as a service and cloud technology. You talked about also right-sizing the team, at least to some extent, and adding staff and finding people who are interested in public service who maybe traditionally had not been. Can you talk a bit about the skills that you were looking for and sort of what makes up the modern skill set for the IT that you envision here?
I guess I was somewhat biased because actually I was actually one of those crazy people that when I was 15 was approached by government a while back and actually started working for government when I was 15. And so I tried to do the same thing that apparently worked when they recruited me, which was attract people that are really excited about solving hard problems. I almost want the person that's like a Sherlock Holmes that you can just see in their eyes when they have a case, they're excited. And when they don't have a case, they're looking for one actively. So I say I often reward problem solvers. And that's a mantra we repeat. So with that, then what I'm looking for is someone who responds well when you give them autonomy. Because actually, in some respects, there's actually studies that show if you give people autonomy, if you give them measurable progress, they can see what they're doing, which actually helps me too, and then you give them a meaningful mission, that actually will motivate people more than anything else. And so I'm really trying to adopt that philosophy. That's what I try to do as a leader. And if I see people that respond well to them or actually are those creative problem solvers, it really helps with what we're needing to do here. And it's not unique to just IT, because actually I think our biggest successes come when there's an IT person that's willing to actually take the time and actually sit alongside the bureaus and offices, understand their workflows, build those relationships. And so that way, 2 weeks in or 3 weeks in, you have that trust relationship where you can say, I know you've historically done it this way. What if we actually simplified the process and took out 4 of these steps to make it much faster? But you have to have that relationship. The other thing that I try to repeat to people is there are 3 real values we endorse here at the FCC in terms of IT, which is 1, benevolence, which often makes people wonder why benevolence, but I say we're public service, which is, again, first and foremost what we should do. 2nd is competence, and 3rd is integrity. Partly why I picked those is actually there's strong evidence and research that shows if you believe that someone is benevolent, competent, and has integrity, you're willing to trust them. So really it is about rebuilding trust, both within the FCC and then with the public as well.
You've also talked about your vision of becoming almost entirely cloud-based, at least wherever relevant.
Right.
And number one, I'd like to understand a bit about that journey, because organizations of this size, that can be quite a challenge, even though there's certainly potentially great fruit at the end of the rainbow there, mixing analogies a bit. But at the same time, there are also security issues potentially, or at least new considerations from a security perspective in the move to the cloud. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about that migration as well as the way in which you're tackling the security vicissitudes.
Sure. So when I parachuted in, I had previously had different roles, including with the Centers for Disease Control and most recently with the intelligence community. And I had concerns that in terms of providing adequate security, FCC being as small as it was, 750 people, we would not be able to match larger organizations. Just because in terms of, even with 750 people, an IT team, our government workforce is right now about 50 people. And not all of them are IT security people. And even if I had 50 IT security people, which would be great, that would mean that there wouldn't be anything else we were doing, that would still not be enough. And so initially, for the first probably about 4 or 5 months, I actually tried to reach out to the Department of Defense and then actually see if the Department of Defense would be willing to actually host. But of course, they've got .mil, they still got to get their things together, and we're a .gov agency. And so it was interesting exploration just to see if they could actually bring what they could there. But in the end of the day, it would probably be better for FCC to actually look at public cloud, because the different large corporations of the world that do provide cloud services will have a much bigger security staff than what we have. And that's what we need at the end of the day. And they will also take care, of course, of the patching and everything like that. So I don't have to invest all my IT in trying to be secure, which is important, but I can actually get that as a service instead. And then I can focus my team more on understanding the unique mission needs of the FCC. I often say we shouldn't be in the business of trying to maintain IT. We should be in the business of actually working with the mission partners to make sure we're delivering services to the public and the private sector. So I don't necessarily think that in all cases cloud is necessarily cheaper. Obviously, we can see some efficiencies if it's a really old system that we're investing in. But what it really does is it buys us both agility in terms of being able to deliver things much, much faster. And 2, it gives us resiliency. So there may still be events that are adverse, but the ability to, 1, rapidly detect that and respond to it, we get with cloud computing much better than client-server on-site.
One of the things that's really interesting about you is your use of social media. I recently had an article in Forbes about the 20 most social CIOs, a list that you were at the head of, one of several that you've been at or near the head of, in fact. Your number of followers on Twitter is one of the proxies, is in the 6 figures, and you are a prolific tweeter in addition to using other social media. First of all, I'd like to understand from you, what are the benefits you get from being so active in social media?
Sure. So it was actually an intentional part when I arrived here. I'd actually not been on social media prior to my arrival, was that I wanted to create an FCC_CIO account.
So to be clear, you had 0 followers 2 years ago.
Exactly. The only thing I had been on was on LinkedIn. And maybe I had following on LinkedIn because it was a personal bio, nothing on Twitter. So arrived, talked to public affairs about creating a FCC_CIO account. It was launched probably about November of 2013. And the goal was really to start the conversation, not just within the FCC, but with the public about what we were trying to do. Because a lot of our systems are public-facing. I fully admit several of them are 12, 13 years old and could be better. But I don't, unfortunately, have unlimited budget, nor do I have unlimited staff, and so we're going to have to triage what we do. And also, woe be it unto me if I try to make changes without at least soliciting input. And so it allowed me to have individual conversations, as well as, actually, the other thing that I also say is, I know I'm going to have blind spots. I say that both internally as well as externally. And there's actually a wonderful article, I think it's 2007, Harvard Business Review, that says, in praise of incomplete leaders, that the best leaders actually admit that they don't know everything, but instead provide a safe space in which people can actually provide inputs and feedbacks. And so I do that internally here. In fact, my team knows that I reward people that actually bring alternative ideas. I ask they bring data. It's not just an opinion, but show some data that actually is rewarded. If you bring a better solution and you have the data to support it, I'll invest in it. Often I see, like, in some respects, my role is almost like being a venture capitalist on the inside. Same thing's true with social media. So having that conversation on Twitter about we have a really hard challenge. Obviously, a lot of other people have tried before my arrival. I don't want to be number 9 of 10, but things like that. And just sharing that narrative, but then also being open to other people sharing information. And so it was important that it was actually me doing the tweeting, not someone else on my behalf. Now, of course, my wife might have some conversations about how much time I'm spending at work, but that's how it goes. But I really think if you accept the mantle of public service, you have to be public-facing.
Thinking about the growth from 0 to where you are now, 130,000 or something in that neighborhood, if I recall the statistics correctly, why such a rapid, why you and not others? How on earth have you gained this kind of traction? What do you attribute it to? And for others who might actually be interested in following your footsteps, like what would you advise even?
Right. That's a really great question. I don't necessarily know, because I'm always humbled every day. One, I started following topics of interest early, and then I started engaging in conversations. I was open to other people's ideas, but I would also share my thoughts too, and it was a conversation. So that led to an interesting connections. There was a group called CXO Talk. They invited me to do some videos early. The other thing that I do in a personal capacity is outside of work, about every 2 or 3 weeks, I host what I call non-attribution creative brainstorm sessions. It's just a place to get together across sectors and just have conversations. And anyone's invited, as well as anyone can invite anyone else. And so it's almost like a real-life social media as well. And that just led to other connections as well. The other thing I feel, again, that a role of a good public servant, and again, it's a matter of negotiating with your spouse, if you have one, about how much time can you spend on this. Outside of the normal work week, making sure at least every 2 weeks, if not more, trying to at least have some discussions with the public. And so opportunities to give talks, not just here in D.C., but across the country, just about the challenges we're facing. Because I believe my job is twofold. First and foremost, obviously, take care of FCC's IT. The other thing is actually having a conversation with the public that says, I know a lot of people feel like government is slow, government is inefficient, and government is broken. And I respect and listen to that. And then I turn back and I say, though, at the same time, it's doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was to provide checks and balances. And so, yes, you may want an extremely effective, efficient, speedy government, but that may be one without any checks and balances. And I really don't want a dictatorship. And so I think that has been an okay tension up until now before the pace of technology acceleration that we're seeing. And so it really is a bigger conversation we need to have, which is how do we continue to do representative democracy with checks and balances, and yet deal with the speed of technology change that's going on. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but if I can have the conversation with the public about that, I think it's an important thing to have, because otherwise we're just going to lose public trust, and it's going to become more and more of a divide between the private sector and the public sector. That could actually be an existential threat to our nation.
It's remarkable, I often find, just how the tools are available for people now to develop and maintain a network that are not used in the way that you just described, that you've got potentially, hundreds of thousands in your case, of people who you can solicit ideas from or ask questions to. I wonder, are there some examples you can give, or an example that you can give, of a question pulled of your network with some creative responses that came back that led to ideas you're in the process of implementing?
Sure. Actually, there was about a year ago, it was about 6:30 p.m. at night. I was getting ready to go home. And someone on the West Coast tweeted a conversation that, everyone should use GitHub, which is an open source platform. And I'm a big believer that GitHub, in fact, we actually post our code at FCC on GitHub. It's open source and you can see it. And so I agreed. And then the person tweeted back and said, the day a CIO is on GitHub is the day that the world changes. And I listened to that, but I decided to say, the day that a CIO is on GitHub is the day they're an overpaid programmer. And that I fully support my programmers being GitHub. I fully support open source. But really, as CIO, my job should not be coding. I should know how to code, and I should have experience in it. But really what I'm trying to do is provide the space for coders. I'm trying to actually deal with the human interaction and the leadership issues. And so that individual decided to actually create that same night, and so I actually stayed later in the office. It was now about 7:30 to create a space on GitHub to actually ask the FCC CIO anything. And we actually had an online conversation. And so it was a conversation about what are you doing with the website, everything like that. I mentioned that we are trying to untangle the website. The website we have has had a bit of history. There are some very old components that date back to the late 1990s that people really like, but they're HTML 3.2, and we probably need to update that. And then there's the 2010 part, which also needs to be updated. And so it was actually an interesting real-time Ask Me Anything discussion with the FCC CIO through social media that actually gave us inputs that actually informed. We now actually have, if you go to prototype.fcc.gov, some of the elements of that prototype emerged as a result of that social conversation.
Wow, that's fascinating. A great example, certainly. Another very interesting thing about you, David, is just the degree to which you are educated. You spent time either studying and or lecturing at Emory, Oxford University, at MIT, Harvard. Can you talk a bit about sort of this quest for learning and quest for teaching as well, and collaborating in an academic setting, and the way in which you sort of see that balancing against your work professionally?
So to be honest, if you had asked me back in 2002 if I would ever get a PhD, I would say you were kidding. So I signed up in 2000 for a little group called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control in 2000. Mm-hmm. And so, one, I hadn't finished college yet, and two, it was basically because I had both a computer science and biology background. I had worked with government, I had security clearance. And so we were 30 people that were to try and figure out what we would do if a really bad day happened. Now, what was interesting is about every 6 months, Congress would say we were a Cold War relic, we didn't need to exist. And we said, well, the sarin gas attacks that happened in the 1990s in Japan, we also couldn't find all the vials of smallpox in the former Soviet republics. So we said we did kind of need to exist, but we were still 30 people and we were kind of scrappy. And actually, I liked those sort of like almost startups inside public service. It's kind of fun. And literally, it was September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning when I was supposed to brief the CIA and the FBI as to what we would do if a virus event happened. Didn't get that briefing. The team, we all responded. Literally, we piled computers in the cars, set them up someplace else, had people go to New York, D.C., dealt with the response. Didn't sleep for 3 weeks. Stood down October 1st, briefed the CIA and the FBI on October 3rd, and of course, the first advance track shows up 24 hours later. So we were very busy. My boss at the time, after about 2 or 3 years into that, said, you have some choices, David. You can either try and get a rank of either a general or admiral. You can get a rank of MD, get a doctor's degree. You can wait 20 years, or you can get a PhD. And so I decided, well, I guess I'll get a PhD. And literally, I applied to like 15 different places, but it worked out that Emory made a really great offer, and of course, it was right next to CDC, so I could use some of my data when I was with the bioterrorism program to actually complete the PhD, and found I loved it. I found that actually I enjoyed the graduate courses much more than the undergraduate courses, because the graduate courses, when you finally admit, we don't actually know what truth is, but here's an approach to actually try and figure out what truth is, which is fun, in my opinion. And so did that, and then was lucky enough to do postdocs at MIT and Harvard, also connected to the University of Oxford. And I think this is important because, again, I think the world is changing so fast that if we rely on any one sector to have all the answers, whether it be the private sector, the public sector, or the academic sector, or even nonprofits, or the public, we're going to miss how we're going to work together. I think we actually need to build bridges between the private sector, academia, public sector. And so I think I'm best sort of serving as that change agent that sort of spans across those different domains. It also allows me, in some respects, to look at things from different lenses to get the whole picture.
Very interesting. You also mentioned earlier, we're kind of working backwards chronologically here, but you found yourself with a calling towards public service at 15. Not so non-traditional for technologists to get into some sort of professional endeavor, maybe in Silicon Valley, but typically in the private sector. What was your path to the public sector?
Right. So this was 1993, so Google wasn't around yet, I guess. My path was I did computer simulations. And I grew up in Virginia. My father's a Methodist minister, so we moved around about every 3 or 4 years to different churches. And actually, I do realize the older I've gotten, I've become my father. It's instead of being in his setting in a church, it's my setting, which is how do you bring together a congregation that may have different views and different beliefs, and at least get them to at least work together. So when I was 15, I had been building computer simulations of natural events. And literally, it was a combination between the U.S. Navy and the Department of Energy that approached me. So the U.S. Navy approached me and said, would you like to do a research expedition with Dr. Robert Ballard, who had found the Titanic? And this was with what was called the Jason Project. So I, as a freshman in high school, spent 2 weeks in Seal Cortez doing computer simulations and working with him. The same thing that happened that summer at a Department of Energy facility, they had an electron beam accelerator facility, and they needed some computer simulations built. That got me to expose the world of research and government, and it was actually fun. It was also the internet had not even, like, Netscape Navigator hadn't even come out yet. It was Gopher and Archie, which is what we were using, and Mosaic browser. So I guess it really got me hooked on making a positive difference. Later on in my path, I did spend some time in the private sector, enjoyed that as well. But the sense of a hard, compelling mission that's really tricky, I'm sure there are places in the private sector we can find it, but the public sector has it in spades. And right now I know we're the underdogs. In some respects, I like being the underdog. And so I see sort of right now my calling, I have no doubt that it may change over time, is to create the space in which people can almost be entrepreneurial on the inside. I call them entrepreneurs. And almost create startups in the public sector. But yeah, so I often joke I fell on my head at an early age. My parents have sent me the same birthday card, not in a row, but I've gotten the same birthday card 3 different times, which is this kid with a sprinkler on his head. And they say, "Son, we never quite knew what you were doing, but we were proud of you all the same." I don't know where it's going, but if there's anything I can do to at least have the conversation about, it's not that the public sector is broken, it's just that our world is now actually exponential. We're going from having 7 billion network devices in 2013 to 14 billion in 2015 to anywhere between 50 to 200 billion by 2020. That's exponential, not incremental change. Yet again, with checks and balances, our very system of representative democracy was not built to deal with exponential change. We owe it to ourselves to have a conversation about how do we address that before it pulls us all apart.
And you've talked about the need for better collaboration across the public sector, private sector, and academia. Across the public sector, how do you work with your peers and other agencies or departments of the government? What do you share in terms of learning? What do you share in terms of technology, the extent to which it's relevant, and so on? How does that work?
Sure. So one, it's a combination of one on social media. In fact, the good news is I'm seeing more and more public sector, not just CIOs, but even individuals showing up online and having conversations online. So one, it's we talk online. Usually it's when we're commuting to work in the morning, when I take the train, or when I take the train back home. We're tweeting back and forth. Second, it's through that, like I said, I do that informal meetup. That's a good way to have conversations. Conferences as well. I have increasingly actually tried to encourage people that do organize conferences that it's more valuable to me actually to have my team meet with other team members as opposed to just CIO to CIO. One, because CIO to CIO, that's great, but that's top-down. I'm a big believer that if we only do top-down, in fact, top-down I think increasingly will not work in rapidly changing environments, we have to do bottoms-up. And so the way I operate here is if I see opportunities for someone from my team to interact with someone from another organization at the federal level, state level, local level, or even with the private sector, I encourage it because then that helps elevate ideas that then they may pitch internally, again, like being the venture capitalist on the inside. And I say, bring data, show why you think this is going to work. Usually I ask them for 3 reasons why they think it won't work, and then 3 reasons why they might be able to mitigate it. And if they have those 3 reasons, then I know it's good to go. If they're not sure as to how they're going to mitigate it, or they don't know why things might fail, then I say, well, spend a little bit more time, talk to people why it might fail, and come back to me. And then we invest.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Related topic, as we've talked about a variety of different trends that you're exploring, again, trends like the cloud, trends like virtualization, the various aspects of leveraging technology towards an end of modernization. Are there other trends that particularly excite you as you look a year, 2, 3 out, personally or professionally, that you're hoping to explore further? What are some examples of those?
Sure. So I was lucky enough to be a Eisenhower Fellow this year. And the Eisenhower Fellowships were created back in the 1950s. They send 9 people from the United States overseas for about 5 weeks to up to 2 countries of their choosing, and then they bring about 45 people from overseas. And so I went to Australia and Taiwan as an Eisenhower Fellow. I took leave from work.
The geographies are your choice?
Geographies are your choice.
How did you choose those 2?
I chose Australia and Taiwan because, in my mind, they were bridges between the East and the West, as well as they were interesting analogs, recognizing not exactly perfect fits of democracies as well. And they were also about the same size. They were both 24 million people. But obviously, Taiwan's geography versus Australia's Taiwan is very different. So in Taiwan and Australia, got to meet with the ministers of communication, justice, and defense, as well as with the industries, which I thought was good to get those 2 different perspectives. One, a lot of what we're seeing here in the United States is happening in both countries as well in terms of how can their forms of government keep up with exponential change, and is that causing distrust between the public and the private sector? And so I think that shows that we're not alone, but we need to start having these conversations before something really goes bad. Second, the other thing, though, was the Internet of Everything. And so that's, again, the idea that we're going from what in some respects, I say the Internet of Things is already here, which is it is made of things, your phone, you have a Fitbit or whatever it might be. The Internet of Everything is when really almost everything in your world has some connection to the Internet. And what does that mean? And so I see this as a huge opportunity, but again, it's going to challenge how do we do security? How do we do privacy? We already know there's challenges with trying to do security on the Internet alone. As we bring in all these other devices, maybe we need to approach this more about resiliency. And maybe I'm owing this to my public health background, which is we recognize that there may be times when you get sick. In this case, it may be a device that gets sick, but we want to rapidly detect that, try and contain it, and then try to mitigate it so it doesn't affect other people as well. And so maybe that's what we need to do. And then it's also just how do you continue to do the act of working together? If government is those things we choose to do that we aren't able to do alone, what are those things, and how do we do that in an everything age? Also, if I give one quick example. So at the FCC, when I arrived, shortly after I arrived, the FCC rolled out what's called the FCC Speed Test app. And this was interesting because, you've seen websites where you can test your connection speed. This was something that if you chose to voluntarily, you could download it to your phone and actually test your connection speed up to 3 times a day if you wanted. The code was open source, so you could actually see what it was doing. We actually got praise for one of the most simple terms and conditions, so it wasn't 40 pages. It was actually very clear as to what it was and wasn't doing. And it was actually privacy by design, in the sense that we didn't collect your IP address, and it was also being sent to a third party that before we even got it, we didn't know who you are within a 5-mile radius. And so I think these are things that we need to talk about across sectors, which is what are the different trade-offs and what do we want to do in this way to actually sort of do things that historically were done, in this case was done by the government. We had to pay for cars to drive around, we had to pay for installations in homes. But by having people opt in, this was a way of almost producing the first crowdsourced map of connection speed by a provider across the United States. The other thing that was interesting was it turned out the public was quite hungry for something like this. It was the 4th most downloaded app right behind Google Chrome for a while.
Wow, incredible. Well, David Bray, thank you so much for joining us on the Forum on World Class IT. It's been a really interesting conversation.
Thanks for having me, Peter.